My name is Andrew Skopecek, and because I am going to be attending Taylor University for psychology, pre-med, and neuroscience, I want to give a summary of 3 books that I consider to be foundational to the field of psychoanalysis and neurological studies of the lower regions of the brain. I have chosen 3 different authors from 3 different important time periods in psychological history to introduce key concepts. To begin with, I have The Ego and the Id by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is the founder of psychoanalysis in the late 1800s, and in the book The Ego and the Id, he introduces completely brand new concepts to psychology. He was the first to propose in this book and in his debut book, The Interpretation of Dreams, that the human mind can be separated into 3 parts: the ego, the id, and the superego. In the book, he illustrates starting with the ego, and then the id, and the superego, and so that's how I will summarize it here. The ego is who you are, who you identify as. It's me, Andrew, and it's you. And you carry your ego with you throughout your entire life. The id is your instinctual urges and desires, the craving to eat, the craving to sleep, the craving to reproduce. Everything that is not 100% consciously started, that arises in your mind from unknown locations. He proposed that the id was a more primitive aspect of the mind and that it developed before the ego. The superego is the portion of our minds that's socially orientated. It's our morals. It tells us, don't do this, don't do that, be a compassionate person. Maybe don't indulge yourself with all of the food at the table before your friends and family sit down. Sigmund Freud's The Ego and the Id really is important in the field of psychology and psychoanalysis because it provides an operating framework for the identification and treatment of psychological abnormalities. Freud also had many students. One of his prize students was Carl Gustav Jung. Carl Jung expanded on Sigmund Freud's theories of the unconscious and really took over the field of psychology in the early to late 1900s. Today, I will be giving a summary of The Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious by Jung, one of his most foundational works. In The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, Jung explores the psychological significance of mythological stories and dreams. He compares Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, and Hindu mythology, any mythology you can think of, together with each other and sees how they relate to the humans that wrote them. And progressively throughout the book, he uses that to introspect and provide a framework into the human mind and the human unconscious. And out of that has come many modern methods of literary interpretation and movie criticism. He founded the theory of the archetypes, and that is very important to us because it helps to create very enthralling movies that capture our attention. And although Jung expanded greatly on Freud's theories of the unconscious and the social unconscious, later in France, a psychoanalyst named Jacques Lacon created a new school of neo-Freudian thought. Jacques Lacon wrote a variety of books. However, a lot of them were manuscripts of lectures that he gave, and so a lot of the information we have on his theories come from other philosophers who are either there or who have taken the careful time to go through and wade through all of his lectures. Today I will be covering How to Read Lacan by Slavoj Žižek, a modern Slovenian philosopher who is arguably one of the most popular psychoanalysts alive today. Jacques Lacan proposed a social unconscious, whereas Jung was more focused on a collective underlying physiological unconscious like Sigmund Freud. Lacan was more fascinated with how humans interact with each other. And through that, he created his theory of the symbolic order. And the symbolic order can be thought of as a cloud network of ideas, metaphors, stories that humans share in common that helps unify cultures together. All unspoken rules and cultural norms are contained in this symbolic order. And he theorized that anytime you're talking with someone, you're both talking to them and the symbolic order, which contains all of the social prerequisites to have that conversation. And so Lacanian psychoanalysis was heavily focused on observing how his patients talked to him and other people, because that gave him an insight into how the unconscious symbolic order is working within them. Do they use specific words that are indicative of certain obsessions or unconscious fantasies? Do they show any awkwardness when certain conversation topics are brought up, as if they are unable to properly handle situations like that? And through carefully noting each of those nuances to their language, Lacan was able to find out what was burdening them and help relieve it and thus lead to a cure. I believe that these three books together and their insights into the unconscious and practice, psychoanalytic practice, are foundational and necessary for a practicing clinician in psychiatry or neurology. Yes.
What other books would you recommend someone that wanted to study more in this field?
Good question. I would recommend, if you're more interested in stories and mythology, to read the book Two Essays on Analytical Psychology by Carl Jung. If you're more interested in Freud's theory of the ego and id and dreams, I would recommend The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, arguably his most important work. And if you're more interested in the social aspects of psychoanalysis, and like what I've said so far about Lacan, I recommend a collection of Lacan's works called Archetypes. There are two versions of Archetypes, both a summary and a full edition. I recommend the summary to start with. In addition to these authors, there is a modern author, a modern psychology author, named Professor Jordan Peterson. And Peterson has written a very good book called Maps of Meaning. And Maps of Meaning is very similar to the Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. However, it's more updated to modern psychology and modern neurology. And he really goes into what drives humans to do what they do, what motivates people to do what they do. In specific, he was fascinated with why people fought for their ideas and what drives humans to connection. In conclusion, I believe these three books to be great starting points for anyone interested in the field, in the psychological sciences. And any one of these magnificent authors would be a great place to start.